Good afternoon. My name is Christian Herpfer. I am the project director of international project on trust in European democracies. This is a EU project in 12 European countries. And we have webinars, and we had already webinars in the past. So please look at our YouTube channel. There you can find our previous webinars. Today we are very honored to have a new webinar presented by Dr. Marie Uttenthal. Dr. Uttenthal is at the Hertie School and University of Governance in Berlin. She obtained her PhD from this institution, which was a comprehensive study of trust in democratic societies. Her research works towards building clear and closer connections between quantitative research on the one hand and systematic conceptual works in the social sciences on the other. Alongside her PhD, she has taught statistics, mathematics, and research design. She holds an MSc in European Public Policy and a BSc in Economics from University College in London. The webinar today is a presentation of a new and novel conceptual analysis of trust. The analysis is interdisciplinary as it acknowledges, combines influential conceptualizations from political science, psychology, and sociology. The author emphasizes diverging conceptual aspects as complementary and develop an argument for how they relate within different forms of trust. Concretely, Sartori's conceptual guidelines are employed to systematically develop the concept along the ladder of abstraction. As the ladder descends, the author moves from a universal conceptual definition into the development of increasingly concrete subtypes within the realms of interpersonal and institutional trust. The resulting framework centrally exists beyond any particular school of thought, and therefore represents an important move towards multidisciplinary consensus around the meaning of this fundamentally important concept. We are very pleased to have Maria here, and Maria, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Herpfer. Thank you for moderating the discussion today. I'm excited to be here and to present my work. So today, as you've rightly said, I'm presenting a paper on that is a conceptual analysis of trust. And the way that this paper came about was through an extensive reading of literature. And essentially, all the social science disciplines discusses trust and acknowledges it as a fundamentally important concept, as something that is complex, that is multifaceted. But at the same time, there are many debates about the specific nature and the attributes of this concept. So essentially, there still doesn't exist a common definition of what trust actually means. And instead, we see diverging conceptual understandings across the different disciplines. So within political science, trust is emphasized as a strategic calculation, so as more of a rational choice that is based on the assessment of the trustworthiness of others. So to a greater extent, it reflects concrete knowledge and experiences. And as a result, it's a more volatile concept. So it's something that is more likely to be updated as new information and experiences come into play. Within the psychological literature, on the other hand, trust is rather defined as a personality trait. So as a predisposition, something either innate or developed in early childhood. So rather than reflecting so much concrete knowledge or experiences, it reflects one's own configuration of value. So it's more about the trustfulness of oneself and whether one is fundamentally more or less trusting. And as a result, it's a more stable concept, something that is less likely to be updated with kind of a new piece of information, but more kind of displaying a general or disposed sense of trust. And then finally, within sociology, which kind of entered the conceptual scene a bit later than kind of discussions of trust in political science and psychology. Within sociology, trust is really embedded in social relations. So trust matters because we want to engage in relations, because we want to interact with each other. Within sociology, it's emphasized that this concept is in fact neither fully rational nor psychological, but that these two aspects are present in all forms of trust with varying comparative strength. So with my paper and kind of with what I present today, my contribution is that I develop a unifying conceptual framework, so something that exists beyond any of these particular schools of thought, to try and establish a common, to establish common conceptual ground, so kind of a shared starting point to kind of agree on what this concept means. So the framework, as Professor Hertie also said, is a move towards a multidisciplinary consensus around the meaning of trust. I do this methodologically by employing Sartori's conceptual guidelines, developing this concept systematically at different levels of abstraction, which means that I start by defining trust universally, and then I add more and more characteristics to develop increasingly concrete subtypes of both interpersonal trust, so trust between people, and institutional trust, trust between citizens and power holders. And then I finally emphasize that these different conceptual aspects, the rational, the psychological, are indeed complementary, as the sociological literature suggests, but I build on that argument and develop sort of my own argument for how these different aspects relate within the different forms of trust that are part of this framework. So to start us off, briefly introducing kind of Sartori's guidelines here. So essentially, Sartori, so an influential scholar of social science concepts, his idea was that all concepts can be hierarchically or vertically organized along this ladder of abstraction. So essentially, any concept, in addition to having a name, a term, has, on the one hand, an intention, that is the meaning of the concept, the defining characteristics or attributes. And then, on the other hand, an extension, so the empirical reference, the objects that it refers to. And the idea is that the intention and the extension are inversely related along this ladder of abstraction, so that at the highest abstraction level, the intention is at its smallest. I'm only using the very core characteristics to define trust. The extension is at its largest in that it refers to all possible kinds of trust. Then as I descend the ladder, my intention increases, I'm adding more characteristics. At the same time, the extension decreases. I'm becoming more and more specific about what kind of trust I'm referring to. So I start by showing you kind of the framework at a glance, and then I'm going to spend some time going into detail with each step. But essentially, this is what I do. So I take this ladder of abstraction. I start by defining trust universally at the highest level, and then I descend the ladder in 2 steps to the medium and the low level of abstraction, each time adding an extra characteristic. So at the medium level, adding the characteristic of direction, whether trust is horizontal or vertical, and at the low level, adding the characteristic of distance, whether the other actor in the trusting relationship is kind of figuratively close or far away. So let me dive into first the highest level of abstraction, defining trust universally, right? And the task here at this level is to look across all the different scholarly definitions from the different disciplines and look for common kind of neutral characteristics that they highlight. And essentially, I come to the 2 core characteristics. The first is that trust is a positive expectation about the intention and behavior of others. And the second, that trust involves risk. So it's an inherently risky concept in that one accepts vulnerability, for the chance of building and maintaining mutually beneficial relationships. And I argue that these two characteristics are the most recurring across all the different kind of definitions that we see in the literature. I then also establish social uncertainty as the underlying assumption for any kind of trust to arise. So essentially, what I mean by that is that so I can't fully predict the actions of others who in turn might have some incentive to act dishonestly. And I need that leap of faith, that bet of trusting them, to kind of overcome that uncertainty. Right? If I had full certainty in my social relations, I wouldn't need trust. I wouldn't need to take that bet or that leap of faith of trusting someone else. Right? I also emphasize at this kind of highest level that trust should neither be portrayed as fundamentally good or bad. So in the literature, and kind of closely intertwined with writings of democracy, there is a dominant positive portrayal of trust that resonates a lot with social capital theory, which was advanced greatly by Putnam, saying that, who's basically famous for this thesis that trust makes democracy work. So trust enables cooperative behavior in society, it breeds tolerance, it reduces the necessity for enforcing compliance, freeing up resources for other purposes. And all this is necessary to build a well-functioning democratic society, right? So trust is a good thing, it's desirable in that sense. However, this is challenged to an extent by another scholarly tradition that emphasizes the dark side of trust, as Norris called it in her book from 22, that there is also such a thing as too much trust or blind trust, and that rather than seeing it as an inherently good concept, the way to look at it is a bit more paradoxical in the way that we need trust primarily at the societal level. So we benefit from trusting other people in society in general, but at the same time, we need distrust at the institutional level, or we need skeptical citizens to hold our power holders accountable and not just kind of trust them blindly, but kind of consistently adjust our opinion, our decision to trust them based on their behavior and actions. Yeah. And so then finally, I say that universally, the origins of trust is such that trust is in fact a byproduct of otherwise desirable behavior. So generally speaking, you can't create trust for the sake of its consequences, right? Bluntly telling you to trust me would likely make you question my intention and then perhaps cause distrust instead, right? So trust is something that arises indirectly from sources that in themselves are unrelated to the potential benefits of trust itself. Right? So this is kind of the key points to raise at the highest level of abstraction. This is how trust can be defined universally. And with this in mind, I then descend the ladder of abstraction to the medium step, right? Introducing just one additional characteristic, the characteristic of direction. And I basically say that, well, if trust is horizontal, then it occurs between people. It's a symmetrical trusting relationship, and I call it interpersonal trust. Whereas if trust is vertical, it occurs between citizens and power holders. It's an asymmetrical relationship. I call it institutional trust. Okay. So this distinction also reflects the most general conceptual distinction of trust in the literature, which makes it kind of suitable for this medium level of abstraction, right? In different ways we've seen, so Luhmann talking about personal and system trust, Putnam talking about social and political trust, Offer and Stumpka talking about interpersonal and institutional trust, right? So the medium level that I've developed with this kind of just one additional characteristic also reflects in general the two main subtypes of trust we see in the literature. And it holds that institutional trust overall is less developed both in terms of the meaning and kind of the different things that it can refer to as compared to interpersonal trust. And that's another thing that I argue that I tackle with this framework, that, well, I take these two subtypes and then I develop them entirely in parallel, systematically, descending to this lowest level of abstraction, so that even though one in the literature is more developed than the other, within this framework, they are fully kind of following the same path. So at the lowest level of abstraction, I add just one extra characteristic, the characteristic of distance. And that in itself highlights the relational nature of trust, right? So it reflects the figurative link between the actors in the trusting relationship, so that trust within a short range, so within close proximity, is a kind of trust that's concrete, that's particularistic. I define it as something that has a personalized recipient somehow. I can put a face to the actor that I'm trying to deciding whether or not to trust here. It typically arises through repeated interactions, and it has a stronger emotional component to it, right? Because it is within closer proximity. I typically also know something about the incentive structure of the actor that I'm deciding to trust. Whereas overall trust at a long distance, well, that's generalized. So now the recipient is impersonalized. It's someone who is figuratively and likely also literally distant from myself, right? So this kind of trust is more inclusive in the way that it extends beyond just immediate familiarity, beyond the people that I know, right? Or the actors that I can put a face to, and kind of extends a bit further than that. So with this in mind, I then say, well, for interpersonal trust, if I add this characteristic of distance, I either achieve in-group trust, that's in the short range. So people that I know personally, my family, my friends, acquaintances, colleagues, right? It's a thick kind of trust. It's exclusive in the way that it just refers to people I know, right? It's similar to what Putnam called bonding social capital. So I call it in-group trust. It refers to something that typically arises in kind of these close-knit interactions with people I know, people of typically more similar backgrounds to myself. Whereas interpersonal trust at a long distance, well, that refers to people in general, strangers, people I have no previous knowledge about. It's a more thin kind of trust, inclusive, right? In the way that I don't base it on a specific experience with someone. It's comparable to what Putnam called bridging social capital. And this kind of generalized subtype of interpersonal trust, what I call outgroup trust here, is powerful because that is the kind of trust that enables us to build social relations across groups, across ethnicities, religions, nationalities. And it's essentially the kind of trust that enables cooperation in society at large. Particularly within more individualistic societies, this kind of trust is very important because we rely on strangers to kind of a lot of the time, right? To cut our hair, to make our dinner on a Friday, right? All these things, all these different ways that we interact with people we don't know in society. For that to work, right? We require some level of kind of outgroup trust, of generalized interpersonal trust. And so then within institutional trust, I apply exactly the same characteristic of distance, right? Although institutional trust to begin with has a lower level of kind of scholarly consensus around how many possible subtypes there are, how specific they should be. Well, if I apply the same characteristic that I did for the interpersonal case, I achieve at least two concrete subtypes. So I achieve in the short range, trust in political institutions. So that refers to trust in the representational part of the system. So political officials, I can somehow put a face to political parties, people in the government, people in parliament. So this kind of trust is more rooted in partisanship, what I think, what I believe. It's more volatile in the sense that I'm more likely to update this kind of trust as I gain new experiences, new knowledge about the people in this part of the political system, right? Institutional trust at the long distance, well, that I call trust in impartial institutions, right? So now I'm figuratively removed from the recipient of the trust, right? It refers to the implementational part of the political system, the courts, the armed forces, the police as a whole. So this kind of trust is more rooted in impartiality, and as a result, it's more stable. It's not based on kind of a new piece of information I gain about a specific political actor, right? But it stems from a general expectation of fairness, that these institutions will act in an impartial way. And so essentially, I now kind of come back to the framework, right? And kind of having taken this very systematic approach, I've then developed ultimately these 4 concrete subtypes of trust that you see at the bottom here, right? 2 interpersonal, 2 institutional, all stemming from the same universal definition of what trust means, right? The framework is hierarchical, and it exactly exists above any particular discipline. I've just kind of gone from kind of these common neutral characteristics and then added characteristics in each layer. So as the final part of my framework, of my analysis here, I then kind of reintroduce the disciplines. So I essentially say, well, within the sociological tradition, there was this idea that trust is neither fully rational nor fully psychological, but that in fact all types of trust contain both aspects to different extents, right? And so in the way that I've developed trust here as a hierarchical concept, well, I essentially say, if it is hierarchical, then this mix between the rational and the psychological aspect also needs to be addressed at all levels of abstraction. So the way that I do that is I draw a direct parallel between the intention to extension ratio of my conceptual approach being inversely related along this hierarchy, this ladder of abstraction, a parallel between that and the rationality to psychology ratio of the concept itself, always also discussing this inverse relationship in kind of this vertical hierarchical space. So basically I say, at the highest level of abstraction, right, trust was defined universally. I was not yet giving any information about the specifics of the trusting relationship, whether it being the direction or the distance, right? I was just defining trust overall in kind of a non-situational way, right? So by definition, that must mean that the psychological aspect is at its strongest, right? I still don't have anything kind of more concrete to base my trusting decision on. It must come more from myself, from my general predisposed, so to say, sense of trust, right? And then as I descend the ladder and develop these more concrete subtypes, well, then I add more information about the trusting relationship, the direction, the distance, to get to these concrete subtypes where I have more information to make a more rationally based trusting decision. And so then the relationship inverses. It becomes increasingly more rational among the more concrete subtypes than it was at the beginning, where it had to be more psychological by the way that this was defined. Okay. So to conclude, what I've developed here is this hierarchical conceptual framework. It spans multiple disciplines, right? It comprises both interpersonal and institutional trust, developed systematically. It links the comparative strength of the rational and the psychological aspects directly to the hierarchical structure of the framework. And as I've said, represents a move towards conceptual consensus. So where to go from here, right? Well, in the words of Sartori, we need meaning before measurement, right? So I'm hoping that by kind of developing a systematic conceptual framework, we can get closer to having the same shared starting point of what trust means. And that can strengthen the theoretical soundness and accuracy of subsequent empirical models, right? Before I measure and study trust empirically, I need to know what it is. So I would argue that this framework can be seen as a first step to bridging a gap between, on the one hand, this quite complex conceptual literature spanning all these different understandings, and the empirical literature on trust, which in a way is measuring trust much more simply with sometimes just one or a few survey questions. So by starting from this systematic conceptual framework could be a way to then also develop measurement models that more clearly reflect the concept as a whole, right? And that is in fact what I did kind of in the second part of my PhD, developing a measurement model that tried to mirror or kind of reflect more closely this whole conceptual framework. So that could perhaps be another presentation at another time. But for now, I'll leave it there, and thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Maria Uttenthal. Very interesting presentation. We have now a question and answer session for about 30 minutes, and the floor is open for members of the webinar to ask questions to our presenter. Please, the floor is yours. Okay. Should we get out of the presentation, then we can see who is raising the hand? This would be great. Thank you. So if you want to talk, please raise your hand and pose your questions or comments. For us, it's interesting because, as I said, we are studying trust in Europe, and we have the team leader of the Italian team, Professor Domenico Madalone here, and the team leader from Ukraine, Professor Irina Kuzina. Dr. Mohammed, please, go ahead.
Hi there, good afternoon. This is Mohammed Al-Hosni. Actually, I'm part of the Anwar Gargash Academy. Just I'm having a small question, Ms. Maria, about, again, your model, when you showed the comparison between the psychology and rational. Because just I need you just to clarify this to me exactly. Because my understanding that the more you are rational, more logical in your thinking, you'll be more close to trust. But again, when you compare it to the real psychological part, so what do you mean, or as a comparison between this?
Yeah.
Thank you. Do you want to answer this, Maria, or do you want to wait for another question?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer.
Okay. Yes, please.
Thank you very much for the question. So if I understand you correctly, you're saying, well, if you have a more rational trust, if you are more rational in your trust decision, you are more likely to trust. That's not necessarily what I'm saying. I'm just saying that, well, to make trust a more rational decision, then I need concrete knowledge and experiences to kind of make trust be a rational assessment of whether the other actor is trustworthy or not. And that really only exists at kind of a lower abstraction level where I have this information available, what kind of trusting relationship it is, kind of who it is referring to. So that's essentially what I'm saying, that the so not kind of what being rational means for trust, but just that for trust to be for the rational to be part of the trust decision, I need as much knowledge as possible. I need to know as concretely as possible what kind of trust is it that I'm about to extend and to who. And I only know that at the kind of the lowest level.
Clear now, it's clear. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question, Dr. Mohammed. Are there other questions? Dr. Palt, who is a member of the Austrian team, is also here. So many members of our TRUEDEM consortium are participating because it's a webinar of our research project, and we are happy to have so many fascinating guests and participants in this meeting. I have a question abusing my position to Dr. Maria. I was working on horizontal trust and vertical trust in one of my publications, the South version. And horizontal trust referring to trust in people you know, your family, your village, and vertical trust, trust up in society to the meso level of civil society and the macro level of government. In your conceptualization, do you have any reference to this horizontal versus vertical axis, or this does not play a role in your theoretical thinking?
So thank you. So essentially you're saying you had the civil society as part of the vertical level.
Yes.
Yeah. So I really saw it as horizontal is trust between people, whether they're people you know or people more generally.
Yeah.
And defining it as kind of, well, this refers to trust that is symmetrical in the sense that we are kind of all in the same level, right? And then vertical only really being between people and kind of the power holders of society. So anything that is asymmetrical, and I wouldn't say that general trust to other people in society, so civil society is asymmetrical. It's still people, just someone I don't know. So that's kind of how I saw it.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other comments, questions to our presenter?
Can I ask the question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so could you please elaborate on the level of abstraction for intention and extension? And please exemplify somehow how it is changing from low to high.
So it was a bit hard to hear you, so elaborate on what the extension
This is again about levels of abstraction, but not rationality and psychology. It's about intention and extension.
Yeah.
Could you please elaborate a little bit and exemplify?
Yeah,
Thank
yeah,
you.
absolutely. Yeah. So I answer immediately. So intention are the characteristics of the concept. So at the beginning, I say, well, universally, kind of just at its core, I have two characteristics, and that is what comprises the intention. Trust being a positive expectation and involving risk. And then I increase the intention because then I add distance. No, I add direction first, and then distance. These are additional characteristics that make the intention of trust increase. Right? Extension is kind of the empirical reference. So at the top, it refers to all kinds of trust possible. The extension is kind of at its biggest. But then when I get more specific and kind of defining more concrete types of trust, well, then the intention is also smaller. Now it's not referring to all kinds of trust, but only the specific kind, for example, to people you know, or to a certain kind of institution. So the intention are the characteristics that I use to define it with, and the extension are what it refers to in the real world. What kind of trust is it?
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. The next speaker is Professor Margaret Osman, leading survey researcher from Egypt. Professor Margaret, please.
Thank you, Professor Christine, and thank you very much, Dr. Maria, for a very eye-opening presentation. And actually, it raises a lot of issues, and I think it is also it is provoking a lot of new thought about the issue of trust, which is very complex issue. Actually, my question is more on the measurement side. And actually, usually in surveys like the World Value Survey or similar surveys, we are like selecting a list of institutions, and then we are asking people whether you trust this institution and what is the level of trust, etc. And given your model, I think things are seems to be more need to be measured in a more comprehensive way. And I was always thinking of institutions that are not really interpersonal and are not symmetric and are not in-group trust and are not out-group trust, yani, something in between. And I have in mind the social media in general. Do you consider social media as in-group trust or out-group trust? Do you think it is interpersonal trust or symmetric trust? and how, I mean, how especially the issue of radius of trust, given the virtual world that we are living in. What would be the radius trust of social media, for example, in terms of how to model it and how to measure it later? Thank you very much.
Thank you. So it's a good question, and so I would say so trust in social media or in me, I would say so it would still go in kind of the institutional side, right? It's not trust in other people per se, but in the media. And perhaps so I think that the best way to answer this is to say, well, the way I define institutions in this framework were kind of focusing on the formal institutions. So whether it being the representational or the more impartial, but perhaps you are right that kind of more informal institutions are not part of the framework as it stands now, and would perhaps merit almost its own kind of additional type. But so kind of the way I framed this was really, well, people on the one hand, and then formal institutions to say, okay, the different parts of the system. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is the Honorable Abdullah Alameri. Please.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. This is Abdullah Al-Amri from the Mahad program from the Anwar Gargash Diplomatic Academy. I'd like to thank the TRUEDEM team for hosting this webinar, as well as Dr. Maria. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. Now, trust is a really interesting, and actually I find it like a complex topic to touch on. I have a question, which is like, what were some of the challenges that you found in measuring trust empirically? Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Please.
So I think that the difficult thing about measuring trust is to get to develop the right dimensions. So the way that we see trust being measured, mostly it's based on surveys or survey questions that are clustered in some way. And it depends. So different papers will kind of put together different survey questions to measure a certain subtype. And so I think the tricky thing about measuring trust is to really know, well, what constitutes a specific kind of trust? And therefore, what survey question should I include to really capture this specific type that I'm interested in? And I think a framework like the one I'm presenting here can help make those decisions to really say, okay, this is how it's defined conceptually. These are the subtypes of trust that I'm working with and how they arise from a conceptual standpoint. And then use that as the starting point to then build measurement models that captures those specific factors as truthfully as possible, rather than just, for example, taking what's available or kind of grouping together things that seem more or less related. So making those decisions from starting from the conceptual understanding. And I think that in a lot of trust research, in a lot of the empirical work, it's not so clear. So where those decisions come from, of how they've developed these different dimensions of trust, right? And that's why I wanted to develop this conceptual framework, right? To say, okay, before we start measuring, what are actually the dimensions here, and how can we develop them systematically?
Thank you. The next speaker is Honorable Alia Malek. Please, the floor is yours.
Hello, thank you for the presentation. My name is Alia from Anwar Gargash Academy. I have a very simple question, which is what are the next steps for your research on trust? Are there any specific areas or contexts where you believe your framework could be further tested? That's it. Thank you.
Yeah. So I think I think that personally for me the next step would be to build this in an empirical setting as well. So now I have the conceptual part, how would I translate this to an empirical setting? So that would be my goal, right? To say, okay, now can we agree on a conceptual starting point? Then how can we use that empirically? And importantly, kind of saying, well, if we can agree on a conceptual framework, then also the comparability of research and also empirical research could potentially be enhanced, right? So stemming from a more similar starting point, because I think now when we study trust, both in political science and in the other disciplines, right, if it's not defined in the same way to begin with, it's sometimes hard to really know whether the conclusions are indeed about the same thing. So.
Thank you. The next speaker is Honorable Veronika Olganekova, please.
Hi, thank you. I had a little bit of a connection issues before, so if it was covered, I'm very sorry, or if you slightly touched on it before. But I was just wondering, I was in one paper, I was looking at possibility of using psychological tests, so the Big Five model, for looking whether that influences trust, whether in institutions or interpersonal trust. And I was just wondering, when you were at the beginning of the presentation mentioning that part that maybe trust is partly psychological, but we do believe that it's also sort of objective, or it's not purely just hereditary. So I was just wondering whether you think this could be an interesting approach of using some of the developed psychological tests, such as the Big Five model, that recognizes the 5 traits, for sort of understanding whether there is something psychological behind trust too. So I was just wondering, picking your brains up on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think absolutely. I think it could be very interesting to see how these psychological tests relate to trust, and perhaps if they relate more for certain types of people, so more that are just more psychological, where it is more of a personality trait than for others. And I think precisely connecting it more to this kind of these psychological measures, and kind of really engaging with the different disciplines in more depth to understand the origins and how they might differ for different people, could be kind of a very interesting next step. And kind of to kind of really also empirically confirm that these aspects are part of trust. Both, we can't just be rational about it. We have to take a leap of faith, right? And understand that better. Absolutely. Yeah. Happy to also connect on that after the talk.
That would be great. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a question on chat. You compare long distance relations and short distance relations. If you look at this long distance, short distance, do you need different empirical measures, or use the same measures to measure that?
So I would still so the empirical measure would still be referring to the different, for example, the different institutions or people that come out of it. So the distance is my conceptual tool to define, for example, trust in people I know or people I don't know, and that would still be how I measured it. How much do you trust this or this or this institution, right? So I wouldn't need a different empirical approach. I would just have a more clear idea of where these different types of trust came from, in a sense.
Thank you. Just refer to the chat. So we still have 10 minutes. Are there any other questions, comments, praise? Yes, Irina. Professor Kuzina is the head of the team in our TRUEDEM project of Ukraine. She is from Kharkiv University. And Irina, please.
Dear Maria, first of all, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. Probably I'm wrong, but I understood that you just stick to more rational theories of political trust, like trust should be rational. But I was wondering, what would be your comment on Ukrainian situation? The situation is the following, like when the full-scale invasion started February 24th, 2022, the level of political trust, I mean, the trust to our president was very high. Like it's, well, we trusted our leader, but I mean, it wasn't 100% rational because people saw some issues that government doesn't cover. That's why a lot of civic society organizations started to function just to help the so-called government, to so-called help our government in this situation. Like we started to raise money for military, started to help people who suffered from the war. It was civic intentions, I mean, from civil organizations. So, but still the level of trust to president was very high, and people saw that in some situation government doesn't work like 100% perfect. So like it's not rational trust, as I assume. What do you think about it? Like probably it's somehow emotional, or not on the rational arguments are just lie in the situation, like of so high level of trust, because we had like 80% trust in president. We never had it before in our Ukraine. So it's untypical for us, actually. I was wondering, what would be your comments on this situation?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. It's really interesting question. And just to clarify, so I'm not saying that I see trust, that trust is a rational concept. I'm saying that trust is always both, to some extent, rational and also psychological. So coming from not so much about what is being experienced or what is being kind of seen at the moment, but from one's own trustfulness in something that is arguably developed much before a political event occurs. And that so even though I would say that there is always both sides to it. So even if we see some and I don't think trust can ever be explained entirely with a rational argument. There is always something extra. No matter how much I know about a specific situation, trust always requires that kind of leap of faith, right? And so just to clarify that I think there are, and that is kind of included in the framework here, that so what I'm trying to do is just to say beyond, before we start to understand what drives trust and what, let's first agree on what it means, right? And that there is always something rational and something psychological at play, right? And then kind of, but starting from the same point. So I think, so understanding the drivers of trust, for example, in a situation like this, could also be an interesting thing to explore much further, and in situations like in Ukraine, right? So what is driving it at these specific moments, right? But to even get to that, first we need to have it conceptualized and agree on kind of how to measure it, and then we can start to see, okay, what are then actually the drivers? So yeah, that's
yeah. Thank you so much. I was also thinking that the trust is developed like by a combination of rational and emotion and some psychological factors. And it's interesting to search what prevails in different situations. For example, in situation of crisis, or when there is no crisis, like ordinary development of a country. What is combination, what is stronger, like rational or psychological? Probably during the times of crisis, it's more about, sometimes about emotional, yeah. And if it's an ordinary development of a country without any big situation, so to say, yeah, it's probably mostly rational, but it's just some thoughts. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Absolutely, I agree. I think that's really interesting, right? To say, well, they are both always at play, but they will come to kind of come out with varying strength in different contexts, like the ones that you're mentioning here. So that's definitely an interesting thing to look into. Yeah.
There's a question by Honorable Reem Al-Kabi. It's about if there's a sensitive topic before the interview, should you provide more information about the topic before you go to the interview? If I understood this question of Reem Al-Kabi correctly. So the question is, if we have a sensitive topic, should we provide more objective information to the respondent before we start asking questions about sensitive issues?
So
I didn't understand how this information is provided respondent says only we should have more concrete information about the subject before going to interview. So maybe that refers to the interviewers and not to the respondent.
Yeah, so whether to so a sensitive issue, I mean, so I think if we're talking about trust, I would still measure it by asking simply how much do you trust certain institutions or all these different things. And so I'm not entirely sure what you mean by, so whether any of those questions would be perceived as sensitive, or is the question more general, or?
For example, in an interview setting, for example, is it fine if I talk? This is my question.
Yeah. So
no, let's say in an interview setting with sensitive, in a sensitive case, for example, like how to build trust with the interviewee. Should we know more information about the subject? So that's why, we have more trust as well, or we establish more trust.
The interviewee. Okay, so to establish trust between the interviewee and the interviewer. Is that what you mean?
Yes.
So provide more information about the person itself. So I haven't thought about that within the framework of just conceptualizing trust. I think in an interview situation, it's always good to establish a safe environment, right? So where the person feels like they can respond truthfully, and that speaks to whether we're asking them about trust or about anything else. And I think if there is a situation where it's a sensitive issue and the person is not feeling safe to answer, well, of course, then we should try and establish that to ultimately minimize errors in our measurement, right? And try to make sure that we are actually getting the right responses, that people are able to answer as truthfully as they can. Yeah.
I have a question about psychology. There's this psychology of development talking about if a child grows up and has an atmosphere of trust in the family, then this person develops some sort of Urvertrauen, some basic trust, because the experiences are very good. And if a person as a child have a lot of bad experiences, they develop a mistrust. So is this psychological development of trust a topic in your research framework or not?
Yeah, so that would very much speak to the psychological aspect, right? That trust being a personality trait, exactly something that is developed in early childhood based on kind of the socialization that one experiences there. So very much so, then you would have a person that is simply kind of fundamentally higher trusting than another because of kind of what they experienced in their childhood. And that would speak to this idea that, well, to some extent, trust is a personality trait. We start with some kind of trustfulness that comes from either innate or from the family environment. So that would definitely be part of that aspect.
Thank you. The next speaker is Al-Mulla.
Hello, hi.
Hi.
Let me just open my video. Hi, thank you so much for the very interesting discussion, and it's very thought-provoking, honestly, and for hosting this webinar. My name is Zainab Al-Mulla from the Anwar Gargash Diplomatic Academy from the Mahad program. This is a question actually because I have an interest in trust and just in general the psychology. So here we'll talk about analyzing it in a way that is more objective. I wanted to know, where do you see the research over the long term? Where do you see it being implemented? Would you say it would help in the development in like psychology and understanding these emotions and thought processes and everything, or would it help in more practical and logical fields? I was really interested to see your long-term vision.
Yeah, thank you so much for the kind words as well. So it's a good question. I think I see it as So I think that within these different disciplines, psychology and sociology, trust is such an important topic, and so many people care about it and want to understand it better. And I think that the disciplines could definitely benefit from agreeing on more on where it comes from, so that when it's being studied psychologically or in political science, it's much easier to make the links or the comparisons between kind of the results that come out of it, if we can start from a more kind of shared starting point. So, I mean, ideally, so I see it kind of as a fundamental step that ideally could benefit all the different disciplines, simply by bringing them closer together from the get-go, from the beginning, agreeing on what it means, therefore agreeing more on how we could measure it, and ultimately then kind of the results that come out of it.
And sorry, maybe this is like another question, but do you think the drive behind this research problem and wanting to kind of discover this entire area, would you say it comes from a place of wanting to kind of how can I say, objectify trust from a more from what it currently is as like an emotional, more kind of ambiguous concept, to create it into a more black and white constraint? Or I just want to know, like, the idea. It's such a creative research topic, so I'm trying to understand your mind process of how you came up basically with this idea of conceptualizing something like trust.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. No, I mean, so I think I'm not wanting to take anything away from it, or kind of not acknowledge that it is in fact in many situations a very emotional concept. But I think so. My motivation came from just seeing how many different ways it was described in, and how many different ways it was being used, and kind of wanting to clarify so what it all means. And I think I even could see it as different topics and so different concepts in social science are quite vague and quite broad and used quite differently. And I think not just trust, but other big concepts could benefit from kind of spending some time really conceptualizing it properly, to define really kind of from a neutral standpoint, what does this word mean? You know, and then from there it can transpire, and it can go in these more emotional directions and into different contexts.
Yeah.
But really trying to combine not just trust, but social science concepts overall.
I mean, I'm best of luck. Honestly, I'm everything you mentioned, I just keep thinking about, like, you know, all the different schools of thought and how your research could possibly kind of justify or like explain you know, the vague, I guess, especially for me. I'm just thinking how it will help in like philosophy, so understanding like how trust is perceived in political, just politics and you know, getting things done and all of that. So I mean, I wish you the best of luck. It sounds really amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
The next comment is Dr. Halina. You wrote something in the chat. Can you please sum up your text in the chat?
Yeah, thank you very much. So it was a question about how an interviewer and interviewee can establish trust, first of all. And I would just remind, because it was a conceptual study here, yes, not an empirical one.
Yeah.
But when it goes to practice, so we all start with consent, so actually providing to the participants for the interview with information. It should be a written information sheet, maybe shorter or more detailed, it depends. Of course, you should not reveal all your details, but you have to inform about the aim of the study, how it's going to happen, whether it is interview, focus group, whatever, how the data is going to be anonymized, summarized, where and when it's going to be presented, where the personal data is going to be stored, when it's going to be deleted. So all of this should be written and orally informed, and the participants should sign a consent form, not only given the right to get this data and analyze this data, but also to withdraw their consent at any time. So, I mean, all of this creates, establishes and maintains actually the trust itself before the interview takes place, or any type of research. I mean, in qualitative research, we do have to align with ethics and principles of ethical principles of research. That was a question from Reem, if I remember correctly, about establishing trust between interviewer and interviewee.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Balt and the French team in our project. We're working since many months on qualitative research, and we do all this anonymization and so on for weeks and weeks and months and months. So we're happy to talk about it, but we are coming slowly to a close. This webinar will be available on the YouTube channel of TRUEDEM project, and this webinar, but also previous webinars. So please check us on YouTube, and then you can see your own statements and the presentation of Dr. Maria in full colors and full sound. I think we are finishing our hour. Is there any last question, comment, praise of Dr. Maria? There seems not to be the case. So I would like to thank you, Dr. Uttenthal. It was a brilliant presentation, and I thank all people who responded and asked questions. It was a very lively, very active discussion. So obviously the presentation was wonderful and raising all these ideas and questions in our international audience. So I would like to thank you, and thank all participants for the active participation. I think it was lively. And if you want to look at yourself again, just go to YouTube and you can see what you said and what was discussed. Thank you very much. And we have our webinars almost every month. So please check the station. We come back next month. Thank you very much, and take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining. Bye.